Well, looky there, folks. Another graph. Aren't you ready for another graph? This is the graph for the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, which tells us about the macroeconomy. It's very similar to the supply-demand model that we had back in microeconomics, but here we have a couple of different characteristics that come into play. The first characteristic is you'll note that the aggregate demand curve itself is curvy, and the aggregate supply curve is sort of curvy. And the reason is, here we are measuring everything, so there's no substitution from one good to another. That's what gave us linearity in the microeconomics supply-demand model, was the substitutability of one good for another. Here, since we have the aggregate or the entire economy, you can't substitute anything for everything. So it's curvy for that reason. You'll also note that the intersection of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model does in fact indicate where the economy is. Now, I don't think your textbook, I don't think I included the chapter that discusses the various aggregate supply, aggregate demand model characteristics, simply because, well, there's only so much time in the 11-week course. Trying to pack economics into 3 weeks, as you're already feeling, is much more fun than it ought to be. So we're just going to quickly look at this and consider this model briefly. Now, aggregate demand measures the essentially the desirability of the whole economy for things, goods and services. And so if aggregate demand increases, the GDP will grow. If aggregate supply increases, GDP will grow, and the price level will in fact follow. So this determines the price level that the economy measures. If I have movement in the price level, up is inflation, down would be disinflation. Okay? The government, through various policies, can influence aggregate demand, and other policies can influence aggregate supply. Let's consider the two fundamental policy choices. Both physical policy and monetary policy can be used to influence aggregate demand or aggregate supply, and it depends primarily on the focus. If I influence suppliers, such as providing tax subsidies to home builders, for example, or industrial incentives through cheaper loans, that would be a monetary policy, then aggregate supply could be influenced. If I reduce everybody's taxes, and that's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift over to the right. If I increase taxes, it'll cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. And that will have a corresponding influence on where the gross domestic product is likely to be. Of course, again, $14 trillion, that's a hard number to measure pretty accurately, but this is what the model tells us. Now, fiscal policy rests primarily on influencing one of these four elements of output. Y is the general symbol for GDP. We have consumption, that's about 68% of the GDP. Investment, which is about 18%. Government spending, another approximate 18%. I think your book may have some more recent numbers. And then net exports, which is simply the difference between money we receive for exporting goods to other countries minus the money we spend for goods that we import from other countries. If we add these three together, we get about 103%. It varies from year to year, which means that net exports has to be minus 3% in order to get the full measurement of the economy. And we all know that we've been trading, have a trade deficit we import more than we export. And that impacts that part. So the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model tries to give us a picture of the overall economy and the influence of the various policies that can be instituted within the economy. Currently, the talk is of trying to eliminate some of the tax cuts that were instituted several years ago. What will that do to the economy? Well, it's likely that it will cause a shift to the left of aggregate demand, call it aggregate demand 1, shifting to the left from aggregate demand 0. That will cause, and it will cause, a contraction of the economy. Probably that's an exaggerated proportion that you see, but it will cause a contraction of the economy. If I at the same time institute a monetary policy that's expansionary, say lowering the interest rate, that would cause aggregate demand possibly to increase or aggregate supply to increase. So it's likely that if I can increase aggregate supply and then decrease aggregate demand, I might even cause a lowering of the price level, which might improve profitability. Pretty interesting. Later in chapters 27 and 28, we talk about monetary policy. But fiscal policy is basically taxes, and we do a couple other things, but essentially taxes and incentives to buy goods and services.